Hello, hi, my sweetheart. Hello, everyone. Welcome in, welcome in. Hi, Jay. I see you were first in. Hello, Bard. Hello, Tech. Hello, my darlings. Hmm, we have upon us another comfy and cozy reading stream, as tends to be customary on this channel on a Wednesday. I am quite happy with the midweek story time streams. We get very cozy around here. Oh, and speaking of cozy, let's see. Am I able to uh, use another one of our emotes? Look, there she is. A cozy little amber in a little green blanket. Aw, you've been visited by the seal of good luck. Thank you, Fairview. That's so cute. But yes, all of our emotes are in now. We have the sparkle. We have little Amber looking cozy. We have the super cute head pats. The absolutely adorable little heart. And, of course, when needed, I do need a solid bonking once in a while. But I hope you, sweeties, will enjoy all of these new emotes that now live alongside the knife. That one, the first one, was made by Bard, and the new five have been commissioned from a lovely artist called Yishi. So I'm very happy. I'm very happy with our little collection, our little collection of cute, soft ambers down in the chat. So I hope that everyone has had a wonderful day so far. Or if your day is starting, I hope you'll be able to maybe have a nice little relaxing time here with me. Because we are still making our way through the Swiss fairy tales. I believe there are 10 left in this collection. We did 4 last time, so let's see how many I can get through today. And in any case, even once we make our way through all of these fairy tales, I will simply find myself a whole other book to read. After all, there are so many out there, so many little stories to tell, so many nice things to share with my darlings. I have certainly been looking forward to another one of our reading streams. It usually even puts me to sleep. So I have to be extra careful during the rest of the day not to start streaming while I'm feeling too sleepy because I'm also going to put myself to bed. After all, it's always such a nice and cozy vibe in here, isn't it? I know I always like it. Oh, but we have another cute little change. Remember from last time when I had some of my sweethearts give me their little plushy PNGs to put on my table? Well, the collection of sweethearts on my desk has certainly expanded since then. Let's have a look. Oh, look at them. I have so many now. I had to just expand my whole table. Yeah. Yeah, there's so many. All of my sweet little VTuber darlings who wanted to keep me company and put a little piece of themselves on my desk. They're all so adorable, aren't they? Look at that. Can I even name all of them? Oh, probably if I go from left to right. We have my sweet little voidling KK. Then we have the lovely Jiro. And then, of course, um, Phil had to give me one of himself in a little puddle crying. But it's okay, Phil. We got you, baby. Then we have the Sin Snail in the background. And who else? We have. I'm trying to go through uh, all of them in the list because they are not in order. Toshi is right there with the purple hair. And then we have Milky and Ritz and a very cute Chew Octo version. And then there's Sammy with Moogie and Sweet Darling Bean next to Arashi and June and Erina and my dear little Ra. Ra is the one who I commissioned for Bald Amber. And honestly, Bald Amber is the funniest thing I've ever seen. With a shiny, shiny bald head. We have that one as a sticker in our Discord, and it's just hilarious to look at every time. Sure makes me happy. But yeah, I am certainly still in the process of acquiring more, more cute sweethearts to put on my desk. And at some point, I will need a bigger desk. Or maybe even shelves for the future. Let's see how that goes for us. But for now, let's do the thing we came here for. Let me write our usual pinned message in chat. Oh, Bard, thank you so much for your little care package. I do appreciate it. Let me pin this. Right. Hi, hello LJ. Welcome, welcome. Happy to see you. We are just about to get started with uh with our story reading. Laz, welcome in. Happy to see you for story time. So, I hope everyone is super cozy in chat, especially now that you can use my super cute cozy emote. And we're going to go ahead and start with the first story. This is story number 15 in the Swiss Fairy Tales collection, called The Avalanche That Was Peacemaker. And it goes something like this. Sometimes judges and lawyers advise people that have a quarrel to settle their case outside of court. When a person thus decides between two who are not agreed, we say that they are judicially minded. Now, There was once in Switzerland an avalanche that did what peacemakers and honest judges could not accomplish. So it was called the judicial avalanche. Now, in the path of this avalanche, as it began to roll, was a rounded rock called the pagoda curve. This was because it had a turn up and backward like a sleigh runner. At a distance, it looked like one of the roofs which they built in other Chinese cities. Once in a while, the ladies of the village on the slope below held tea parties on it, drinking out of eggshell china cups. Then the maidens pretended they had porcelain feet and ate candied ginger and stuck pear blossoms in their hair. On their part, the boys shot off firecrackers to make believe they were Chinese of the old style. One summer's day, this tremendous avalanche came rolling and thundering down the mountainside, and Pagoda Curve was directly in its path. When it struck this rounded rock, there was not enough of the bulge or recurve to stop the avalanche, but only to give an upward joust or bounce towards the sky. Then the big ball, which for a moment was poised high in the air, hung directly over the houses 500 feet below. This dwarf or village had a name which in English means Tell's apple. Most of the houses stood on a flat place among the mountains which rose round about it, like sentinels in ice armor. The people who built it long ago were great admirers of the famous archer who shot the apple off his little son's head. The place where they kept the pig pens was named Gessler, after the cruel governor. Now in this place, and just at this time, there was a very ugly and dilapidated old house of worship, which had been erected several hundred years before, and was now almost ready to tumble to pieces. For a long time, the question of tearing down the old church and erecting in its place a new one in modern style had so vexed the community that a disgraceful squabble had broken out. The people of one party would not speak to or have anything to do with those of the other way of thinking, and all on account of this old building. The young people were hot for a new edifice. They hoped to get an architect from Zurich, who had gone from their village and had his plans all ready, which the young ladies all said were just lovely. Against these, the old folks held to the idea of keeping the holy house yet a while longer. The aged people were especially anxious that the venerable tower should not be touched, but be kept, and they even wanted to give it a new coat of paint, for which, of course, the younger party would not vote. On this very afternoon, the choir had gathered to practice to sing the hymns for Sunday. The organist had put his foot on the pedals and struck the keys, and the soprano had just opened her mouth when down thundered the avalanche. This was far worse than when a June bug had once flown into her mouth, as had happened on a Sunday night a few weeks before. She stopped, and the tenor's face turned white, as if the crack of doom had been heard. The sexton was outside, sitting on the steps, smoking his pipe, when a lump of ice knocked the pipe out of his mouth, scattering fire and tobacco down into his vest and over his best trousers. Then followed a crash as stone and brick and the lightning rod fell on the paving stones of the street. All thought the world had come to an end, but when they lifted up their eyes to note the damage, they all declared that this was the most obliging and considerate avalanche that had ever visited that region. It simply knocked over the old tower and enough of the church walls to compel rebuilding. The mighty mass rolled past one corner of the village, upsetting a farmer's barn, but doing no further hurt or damage, except to a bob-tailed cat of vicious character. This animal had fought with many dogs, and one that it had scratched pretty badly had bitten off its tail so short that even a rabbit would be ashamed of the measly tuft left on the end, for only what looked like a furry plug was visible. Now this old cat, known as Stumpy, was just that minute about this to sneak up to a bird box, in which were four very hungry little birdies. The mother bird was out, seeking worms from her little folks' dinner. Stumpy was just about to thrust in one of its front paws through the little round hole in the bird box, hoping to claw and drag out the four squabs one by one and eat them all up, when down came the edge of the avalanche like 10 billion of bricks. It just grazed the bird box without doing any harm or hurting the young ones inside, but it flattened out that cat, so that it crawled away alive but limping and meowing most piteously, and with one ear ground off by a bit of sharp ice. The mother bird, returning at this moment, seeing the cat, danced around and chirped out what sounded like "serves you right." The avalanche was last seen when rolling down the valley in the direction of the vineyards, apparently with the fell purpose of overwhelming them all in one common ruin. But on its way, it struck again, right in the face of an out-jutting rock on the side of a mountain, which made it roll around in another direction. As for the church question, that was settled. There must be a new building, and there was one soon, which, when finished, toned up the whole dwarf. At a later meeting, one frivolous youth proposed a resolution of thanks to the avalanche, but this was voted down. Then the fellow brought in a proposition to give thanks for the special providence that had opened the way to peace in the church. This was carried by a majority vote, all the young people being on the affirmative side. That way, the judicial avalanche behaved was a scandal among the frost giants. The old style had been to toss donkeys and their drivers down within glacier crevices into cold storage 1,000 feet deep, to crush houses, kill cattle, and bury more people in one day than the undertakers could put into coffins in a month. Besides, this old-fashioned avalanches used to lay waste to orchards and fruitful fields and spoil vineyards. The conduct of this avalanche, which seemed bent on settling quarrels, was more like that of a nun, a monk, or an old grandmother. It happened to be around the time that the great Napoleon was upsetting the world like a political avalanche, and the Empress Josephine was covering up the red arms of peasant girls, now wives of generals, with long white gloves reaching up to the armpits. Now, in a certain house in the Dorf, an old fashioned mother was scolding her frivolous young daughter, named Angelette, for aping Paris and Napoleonic fashions. She remarked that things had come to a pretty pass when the young snip of a girl needed the leather of a whole goat to clothe her arms. Daddy had also joined in the conversation, but only to lose his temper. In his gestures, the cover of his pipe drove off, spilling the hot ashes all over his daughter's low-necked frock. The sparks made her jump, besides reddening the skin of her neck even more than her arms. The girl Angelette was dressing for the evening dance on the green and was quite put out by the accident. In fact, the old man had seized the tip of Angelette's middle finger of her glove and had pulled off the half yard or more of white goat when the avalanche flew past. It flung a bit of rock, like the bolt of a catapult, right through the window, sending the glove all muddy and torn out the other. Thinking his last day had come, the old daddy fell on his knees to pray, but he was quickly awakened to his senses by hearing a regular concert in the barnyard. Outside, the donkeys were braying, the horses neighing, the roosters crowing, the geese cackling, the hens clucking, and the dogs barking, and all in joy. As for the old billy goat, he stood up on his hind legs and cut up such capers that the whole family of goats began to imitate him by frisking in a circle. Where a minute or two before had been ominous stillness, there had come, in the twinkling of an eye, a salvo of rejoicing in the animal world. It was as if the boarders in Noah's Ark had been let loose and were having a concert. It's a way the animals have of showing their joy with a kind of music all their own, which they can make when the danger they feared is over and deliverance has come. There was also a bride, the daughter of the richest man in the Dorf, who was dressing for her wedding. All the other girls of her set were collecting their old shoes and handfuls of rice, ready to fling after the young couple's carriage for good luck. The bride's goat boots, ordered from Paris, had cost $14. The mail wagon having arrived with the letters and the salt at the post office had just stopped in front of the bride's house and handed out the long awaited package. The servant maid was bringing the lovely white buttoned shoes upstairs when along and downward thundered the avalanche. According to a way that avalanches have, this one flung off at the sides stones, rock, gravel, ice, and mud. Now, like cannonballs in a bombardment, one mass of wet snow, not quite so big as a fat elephant, struck the maid. It knocked her heels overhead, sent her slippers flying, and her feet in the air, until one could see the color of her stockings from toe to knees. As for the box from Paris, it was shot as out of a gun into the pig pen. The bride screamed, but nobody was hurt, and the maid quickly smoothed out her hair and dress, put on slippers, and she was soon presentable. It was weeks after the honeymoon and return of the couple that, after searching up hill and down dale, the remains of what were once a pair of white boots from Paris were found in the black mire among the pigs. Not knowing what it was, the porkers had crushed it under their hoofs. After trial with their teeth, unable to eat it, or its not tasting nice, the pigs thought it was not worth a turnip. One piggy, without chewing, had actually attempted to swallow it. Not finding it suited to a hog's diet, the animal had dropped it with a grunt and trampled on it. When fished out with the long-handled pitchfork, it was recognized as a Paris shoe by the two white buttons which had escaped the blackening of the mire. By this time, the proceedings of this avalanche, which had started out to settle quarrels, had become positively frivolous. Wobbling about here and there, reeling like a man with a quart of brandy in his stomach, the mighty ball rolled down the long road, leading into a larger village. Now, fancied the frost giants that were watching from aloft, it surely will uphold the reputation of the family and act like other avalanches, in turning villages into cemeteries and farms and vineyards into deserts. This lively chit of an avalanche followed the road far enough to tumble flat into the ditch some drunken fellows who had just come out of the gin house and were staggering homeward. It was like ironing out clothes to see the way that avalanche flattened out these men. It left them for hours on the roadside, faces downwards, and sleeping off their drunken foolery. When they woke up, as out of a cold bath, they shook off the snow and trudged homeward, only to get from their sharp-tongued wives the scolding they richly deserved. Many another adventure did that judicial avalanche have before it had scurried past other villages, but hurting next to nothing, avoiding forests, farmhouses, and vineyards, until it reached a glacier over which it rolled. Scratching, cracking, dropping out dirty stuff, rock, and gravel, it acted like a dredge box. It sprinkled out its contents to fill up the great deep green crevices in the ice, until it finally reached a big open space of wasteland that had nothing on it but rocks and bushes. Then, with a roar, as if laughing at itself, it broke up, spread open, and left the place strewn with more rocks and stones and lumps of ice. Then a troop of fairies came riding on the hot, dry south wind. They blew with their breath on the snow mass and quickly melted it into the river so fast that men wondered at the high water in the distant lakes and the rivers in France. In lovely Switzerland, new soil was made, where today are farms and vineyards. In time, billions of purple clusters are plucked, and willing tourists are happy in taking the grape cure, while they walk over the place where once a judicially minded avalanche had laughed so hard that it burst. And that is the end of the first story for tonight. That one was quite interesting, don't you think, darlings? The story of an avalanche that came rolling down a hill just to say, this will be a decision. I have to say, I think I need to zoom in on the page just a little more because the letters are a little small for me, but that's alright. I don't really know what to make of the story, honestly. Yeah, it sounded like it was a bit of a random one, wasn't it? Just the story of what happened while an avalanche rolled down from the mountains. Yeah, I'm just going to enjoy a little bit of my tea. Tonight I brought myself some nice black tea with a little bit of extra spice in it, like the kind of spice you would have in a yogi tea, like a really nice sort of wellness blend. Mm. It's very nice, actually. I hope my sweethearts uh, are having a lovely time being all cozy. We have some weird stories. Mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Tech, however, I have to say, I'm really enjoying a lot of these Swiss stories. They're all very, very nice and comfy. Nice. Hello, sweetheart. I'm happy to see you. I hope you're all nice and cozy over there, enjoying my voice. And who else made it in? Egg. I'm happy to see you as well. Please enjoy the lurk as you draw. And Jars, my sweet, precious little mouse. Oh my goodness. You look so comfy there. How sweet. Mm. Tsuki, hi. Welcome in, welcome in. Happy to see you here with us. We're about to start on the second story of the evening. This story is called The Fairies and Their Playground, and it goes something like this. Once upon a time in Switzerland, there was a golden age for cows and people. This was before the country had become the playground of Europe and the land of 1,000 hotels. It was before men climbed mountains for pleasure, or imitating the New Hampshire people on Mount Washington, had built railways to their summits and filled the land with wires and rails. Not then could the Edelweiss be bought in a dry goods store or in the market. Not then did lazy and soft-muscled tourists pay money to have burned upon alpenstocks the names of 100 mountains, which they never even saw, except from a hotel porch or distant window, or from the train. Then, as the old ladies tell us, summer lasted during 10 months of the year, and the very mild winter only 8 weeks. Flowers were everywhere, and the bees were so busy that immense caverns were stored within the honeycombs which hives could not hold. Colossal stalactites and mosses big as cabbages were common. Then the land was so rich in clover and grass that grew up to the very tops of the highest mountains that the cows had to be milked 3 times a day. They were so large and fat that the milk was poured by the bucket full into tanks so big that the milkmen went round in boats to skim off the cream in the making of cheese. These balls and discs were so thick and so big around that the dairymen had to be very careful in piling them up in the storehouses. For if, when rolling one inside the door, it broke loose and went tumbling down the valley, it might destroy a village, and people might think it is an avalanche. In those days, there were no mists or storms, or barren rocks, or dangers of landslides. On the day for churning out the butter from the cream, they used to employ the giants and give them big dinners for their wages, for the churns were like towers for height. This was the story of the Golden Age, as told by the old folks who sat on their stone seats in front of the quaint wooden houses. As told year after year, everything grew in size, just as an avalanche starts as a snowball and is finally able to wipe out a whole village, including modern hotels, as is done occasionally in our day. But what happens always when people get too rich or prosperous followed in this case also. It went to their heads. Then they became proud, lazy, and often cruel. Gold got to be as common as iron or lead had been, yet many old frums and codgers wanted more. Then misers became numerous. Such fruit grew out of the root of all evil. It seemed as if there was nothing more deceitful than those very riches which their ancestors knew nothing about. In such prosperity, the farmers and shepherds as foolishly thought lay the secret of all joy. They had imagined that if they could only get and increase what they could sell for money, it would make them, as they used to say, perfectly happy. The climate changed, and gradually the whole land grew colder. Snow covered the mountain tops. Rocks, storms, fog, mist, and clouds lay long over the land. Landslides occurred often, and avalanches ruined the meadows and villages. Huge rivers of ice, called glaciers, leagues long and hundreds of yards deep, were formed. These covered up the flowers. Summers grew shorter and winters grew longer. Grapes and fruit shriveled up to their present size, and cows and goats were no longer such givers of food as of old. Milkmaids, who had to work with a cow thrice a day to get 2 small pails of milk between daybreak and dark, wondered at the story of the Golden Age, which the old folks constantly told. They wished they had lived then, when a boat instead of a bucket was the sign of a dairyman's shop. Many looked wistfully up at the ruins of an old tower, now ivy grown, where the owls hooted at night. They wondered, when told that in the Golden Age this was the giant's churn, in which boatloads of cream were turned into butter by the good-natured monster who ladled out the yellow delicacy with a shovel as big as a pine tree. In the Golden Age, the fairies were very numerous, of many kinds, and always busy. Some were rough and loved to play tricks on stingy farmers, bad-tempered milkmaids, rude boys, and naughty girls. But most of them were always glad to do something nice and pleasant, and especially to help kind people in their work. But when the age of steam and smoke and puffing locomotives and boats with iron chimneys that breathed out choking gas from their furnaces and left clouds of blackness on the beautiful blue lakes and landscapes had come, the happy days changed to gloom. Men made railroads up to the very tops of the mountains and stuck their big hotels in the prettiest places, even in the high Alps. They spoiled the village dances, drove away the poor people from their old amusements in summer, and even turned thousands of the once honest Swiss folk into money grabbers. Then the fairies lost all patience and determined to call an outdoors congress, such as the mortals do at the Landsgemeinde or town meetings, when they talked politics and voted by thousands, raising their hands to mean yes or no. One fairy that was the lawyer and politician of the Swiss fairy world was especially angry when it was learned that even the children were taught by their parents to tell lies about their mother being dead when she was waiting in the chalet for the money the little girls got by telling doubtful tales and thus moving the pity of travelers. One day, after hearing some of these dreadful stories, the fairy took the form of a pedestrian tourist and walked along a well-beaten path in the mountains. Coming to a closed gate, which shut off the passage, it was opened for him by a little girl not 10 years old, who said plaintively with tears in her voice, "My mother is dead." At this, the kind-hearted fairy in human clothes nearly dropped his alpenstock out of sheer sympathy. Taking out his purse, he was about to hand the child a silver coin when, looking up at the doorway of the chalet nearby, he saw a woman standing and peering out with keen interest. He hesitated a moment and then inquired of the little gate opener whether that were her mother. She, having learned to speak her piece, but not prompted as to any further question, replied at once, "Yes." At this the fairy in disguise lost his temper and said to her, "You little cheat." Then he shut up his purse and passed on. Quickly changing into his former fairy form, messengers by the score were sent out by him over the mountain tops, down in the mines, under the lakes, over the pastures, and wherever fairies of any kind or sort lived. These were all summoned to the meeting. The hour and place of gathering was named, and it was promised that all, whether pretty or ugly, slow or rapid of speech, and whether of land, water, air, or snow, should have a chance to talk, all being limited to a quarter of an hour each. What was of the most importance was the guarantee given that all delegates should be excused and the whole meeting break up before sunrise, so that no fairies would be turned into stone when the sunbeams should strike them. No ogres or man eating giants were invited to this meeting, for the Swiss fairies are a very respectable lot of folks. In some countries, they do not have anything to do with gods or devils. They are very particular as to who or how or what they regard as fit for society or look upon as equals. Such beings of uncertain reputation as the gods or the fates or the devils or any of their tribe were not known in their fairy society. It is said that such beings used to live in the mountains when the Romans were in the land. Many people said that some of these used to live still further back and long ago in certain mountains and caves which could be pointed out. But they went away forever after the good Saint Fridolin, and others came to Saint Gall and Appenzell from Ireland 1,000 years ago. When the idolaters in China or Japan would build a temple for their idols, they inscribed it on the bells that gods as well as devils have paid or subscribed money to help rear the structure. But Swiss fairies are better educated, and they have nothing to do with either gods or devils. These creatures have no reputation in Switzerland and are not received into fairy society, for the Swiss fairies approve of churches and never hurt them or the good people who go to them. In fact, what all the fairies resented most, and about which they were as mad as fire with mortals, was that they had brought in such creatures of their fancy into the country. Men described the worst one of the lot as having hoofs, horns, a sooty skin, hooked nose, forked tail, and sulphurous breath. In other words, this fellow was something altogether different from any sort of fairy in earth, air, sky, water, cave, or mine. Besides, though the demons had the reputation of being always very busy and very smart, they never did anything good, nor helped honest mortals, as the fairies often did. In truth, the fairies of every sort held their noses, and otherwise showed their dislike or contempt whenever anyone made mention of the name or the deeds of demons or devils. What made the lovely fairies and the frost giants awfully mad was that human beings should name the pretty scenery, the wild crags, and the rocky valleys and mountains after one they called His Infernal Majesty. A certain fairy told the story of a funny mortal who had got mixed in his ideas. She had overheard one bumpkin find fault with the president of a college for inviting a popular preacher to address the students. "He's an atheist," said the fellow, "for he does not believe in a personal devil." At which both fairies laughed heartily. It was the general opinion, however, that mortal men could do wonderful things. They might build railroads up to the mountain tops, harness every waterfall, fill the valleys with electric machinery, and erect observatories to study the weather and the stars. For all this, the fairies paid them due honor. It was a knowledge that, And one thing, some of the native mortals could beat the world, that is, in holding out their hands for a gift. Fairies thought this was because they had a disease called itch of the palm, but they noticed that a coin always healed the trouble and caused the fingers to shut up finely over the silver. But when human beings gave credit for the smart things which the fairies used to do to the monster they called the devil, they were vexed indeed. Both the frost giants and the flower fairies declared that they would go on with their work, for who or what could stop either of them? Besides, no human being could produce anything so pretty as a flower or a snow crystal. At the idea of their making edelweiss out of cantil flannel and selling these bogus things in the shops, they laughed again and again. In spite of railways built up the mountains or tunnels dug into them, the gnomes and the kobolds declared fiercely that they should have their own way down below the ground so long as there was any fire left in the earth. The Undines and the Herbishers made their boast that, while glaciers melted and became rivers, and lakes were lakes, and marshes grew reeds, they and all the water sprites were determined to have as good time in their own way. They would enjoy their tricks and play their pranks on silly mortals as long as they pleased. There was too much fun in it for them to give up their old customs. Besides these foolish fashions that will pass away, said the priest, there was one place where machinery or the gimcracks of investors and all this chatter about science or anything else can never destroy. None of these things can reach the hearts of children. Then he went on to say, there will always be a new generation who love us. Even after all the learned men and scholars and prudes and fault finders shall have had their way and tried to drive out the library such splendid fellows as Santa Claus or William Tell or Humpty Dumpty, they would climb through the window, go down the lightning rods, and from the chimneys into the nursery. Even if the prudes tried to abolish the fairies by law, and shut out all the fireplaces, and did away with sleighs for automobiles and had airplanes in place of wagons, even then a new lot of fairies and heroes would come in and take the place of the banished old friends of the children. They would sit in their chairs, peep in at the windows, live in the nursery, and refuse to be driven out. In Switzerland, they would hide in the milk churns, or behind rocks, or in the ice caverns. In a word, never having been born, they could not die. A wise old gnome spoke for his companions as follows. It is only those creatures that have bodies and have to be born and must eat and drink food every day that get old and have to be buried. Besides, every fairy knows that while thousands of tourists come year after year in their bodies, as in sleeping cars and day coaches, very few ever really get into that Switzerland, which after 2,000 years has grown up in the Swiss heart. These foreigners come and go and eat and sleep and drink, but what did they know of the Swiss soul? One ancient fairy that looked as if he might be several millions of years old, who had a name too long to be pronounced, but which means, when translated, I told you so, summed up in his speech what he had seen come to pass since mortals arrived on the earth. He had looked upon the lake dwellers, the Romans, the barbarians, the visitors of all sorts and times, and finally the hotels and tourists. There have been many changes of fashion since I paid any attention to mortals, said he. Then he made them all laugh by continuing. Once nobody cared for the mountains. Now all human folks are writing poetry about them, or climbing them, or punching their faces with alpenstocks. Once no one loved the flowers of the Alps. Now foolish mortals, in both trousers and petticoats, come with their long purses, but they are too lazy to climb up to the real Alps and pick the blossoms where they grow. So they buy them, already and artificially made in the market. They go shopping for Canton flannel edelweiss, as they would for soap or toothbrushes. They stick these woolen things in their hat bands, and they have their alpenstocks branded with the names of places, whether they have been there or not. Or they make belt bouquets of the alpine roses or glacier violets, and then strut about as if they were explorers. What fools these mortals be! At this, all the fairies of every sort and kind laughed so uproariously that the meeting adjourned in disorder. Yet they all went away happy, for they felt sure that whatever foolish mortals should do, Switzerland would still be the fairies' playground. And that's the end of the story. That was also quite a strange one. Oh, my dear Bard, thank you so much for your care package. Mm, I will certainly make sure to stretch out my back, give my old bones a little bit of a crack, sit up in a better position, and certainly have a drink from my tea. Mm. Oh, Dice, sweetheart. Thank you for the head pat emoji. I love that one very much. Just cute, soft little head pats for Amber. Oh, and a little heart from Bard. How nice and gentle, my darlings. Las, I. Little did they know that children these days have smartphones. That's very true. And the internet. That's exactly where I am reading these fairy tales from. A website. Although I'm sure having a physical copy of a lovely fairy tale book to read to all my sweethearts would be just as nice. Maybe if I come across some kind of old book that has a collection of short stories I could read to you, I would be very happy to acquire it. I hope everyone is as comfy as you could be in this moment with me. And I hope you got yourself a nice warm drink or a nice blanket or just a lovely quiet evening, if it is at all evening for you. You have Borg? Oh, Deck. That's delicious. How lovely. Enjoy. So, let's go on to the next story. Number 17. This one is called The Kangaroo Poe, which I suppose is the name of a flower. And it goes a little something like this. During millions of centuries, a battle on between the frost giants and the flower fairies. Occasionally, for a few tens of thousands of years at a time, the ice rivers and the snow avalanches would roll down the mountain sides and smother or crush all the pretty blossoms. Rocks and stones in the glaciers would squeeze the leaves and tear out the roots so that nothing could grow. Then the whole land would become a cemetery of ice or a graveyard covered with snow, for all the plants of every kind were frozen stone, hard and were dead beyond hope. Nothing could be seen but jagged rocks and sharp peaks rising up out of the desolation. No bird, beast, insect, or fish could live in such a world, for there was nothing for them to eat or to grow with. Though there was plenty of water, there were no fish. Cows could not graze, or goats or deer find any grass or moss, and dogs would die at once for lack of meat. But the sun in the sky was always the friend of the flower fairies, and he kept on fighting Jack Frost and the glacier giants, mating, melting the ice and snow and making rivers that carried off the cold water to the sea. So by and by, after a few millions of years had passed by, the fairies, who never die of old age, got together in a meeting. After talking the matter over, they resolved to have a flower that could fight the frost giants by laughing in their faces and keep on growing, no matter how hard the winds blew, or how deep the snow was, or how often the avalanches fell or glaciers formed. Besides being able to live and find its own food by rooting itself deep in the crevices of the rocks, such a flower ought to be sweet and taste good to the cows. In this way, pastures would be coaxed to cover the meadows of the high Alps with their green glory, well spangled with blooms. Then men could get milk and make butter and cheese. The fairies liked good boys and girls and were always glad to help their fathers and mothers, and they all loved meadows with plenty of flowers and grass for their moonlit dances. They never enjoyed this, their favorite amusement, so much as when in the spring the fields or the heights were both fragrant and beautiful. But how could a pretty plant, such as they wanted, get clothes enough to keep from shivering all winter? How could a flower be made hardy to laugh at Jack Frost when he came to bite her? The fairies, young and old, all thought it over, but no one could tell how to begin or proceed. The young ones thought much of gloves and muffs, tippets and leggins, hoods and earmuffs, thick stockings, and fleecy lined gloves. Yet how could these be made to fit a plant? It was natural for them to think in this way, for all their things to wear were on the outside, both for grown ups and those fairies that were more like big boys and girls. On the other hand, the fairy mothers were all the time thinking about the baby's life, and not only how to cover the young thing, but also to have it warmly wrapped up when it was still very little. They brought to mind examples of children well bundled in furs for cradles and hung on the branches. Some told of little babies all swaddled in furs that are given a lump of whale blubber instead of candy and skewered on a stick so that it will not swallow the tidbit all at once. Others told of Italian bambinos wrapped up tight, but none of these seemed to give the right idea of what was wanted. At last, one old grandmother fairy made a sign that she wished to speak, and all listened while she talked. You fairies had better stop thinking about human beings, for not one of them could live where we want this flower to grow. It is too cold, and the frost giants already own the country. Better look to the animals to show us how. Now I have heard of a two-legged creature that yet is not a man nor a woman, and another one with 4 legs that carries its babies, even a whole family of 4 or 5 in a pouch in front of its body, until the little ones can take care of themselves. In this way, they are kept free from danger until they grow up and can provide for themselves. Oh, do tell us about these wonderful creatures, cried all the young fairies at once, and, though the old folks were silent, they were just as eager to hear. Well, the 4-legged creature is the opossum and lives in America. The mother carries a whole family of her cubs in a pocket which she wears in the front of her dress. She can even climb up a tree with her family. Who can believe that? Whispered one fairy to another. And the other? She asked, hardly believing such a thing was possible. Let me tell you then about the kangaroo that lives in Australia. She has a wallet or a traveling bag where or in which she stows away her little folks, and there they are as cozy as if they were riding in a wagon. Yet, all the time, they can look out and see what is going on in the world. In this way, both the young opossum and the kangaroos are kept warm and are fed until they are grown. No wolves or bears or foxes can catch and run away with them. Can a kangaroo climb a tree? Asked a fairy whose fancy had been greatly taken with the idea of a whole family being up a tree at once and free from the wolves. The old fairy felt insulted, or thought the questioner was trifling, and made no answer. So there was quiet for the space of 3 minutes. Well then, asked still another fairy, can you furnish us with a vegetable kangaroo? This was asked in a tone of contempt, as if she believed it were not possible to protect anything from Jack Frost and the giants, even though the sun helped with all his might. Well, not exactly the Australian jumper or the American tree climber, but if we can persuade the sun to help us, we may get a plant to become more mother-like and keep her babies at home until they are weaned and warmly clothed. Then, when they grow up, they will be able to find food and set up housekeeping for themselves. So it came to pass that the sun and earth and the fairies, all agreeing together, they invited a plant named the Po to come in their country to live and raise children that could stand the cold. As fast as the glaciers or ice rivers melted, the fairies coaxed the Po family to multiply and come up higher. This the plants always did, increasingly in numbers, like a great army. They climbed higher and higher until they formed acres upon acres of meadow land for the cows and goats that enjoyed the delicious taste of the ripened grass. When the glaciers had retreated and melted away, the Po covered the land. The cows multiplied. They were fat and sleek because of rich food, and men won wealth by making butter and cheese. The young fairies watched how the Po grew and cast its seeds, and they called it the kangaroo plant. And this was the reason why it was named by the fairies the kangaroo plant. Watching its opportunity, the Po alpine started every springtime from the lower meadows to go up on the mountain tops near the stars, in time becoming victorious like an army. Instead of dropping its ripe seeds to the ground, or having them blown far by the winds, or letting them leap out like popcorn, or lending them the wings which dandelions have, or trusting to the birds or sailors or men who sell seeds to farmers, the Po had a new way of its own. The mother stalk held her babies, that is the seeds, as long and as close to her as an opossum keeps her cubs or a kangaroo her kittens. Instead of first weaning them and then letting them go away to play or ramble abroad out of her sight, she kept them all with her until they were fully grown, that is, until they had both leaves and roots. For these are the legs and arms of a plant, whether it be a Johnny Jump Up, or Sweet William, or Ragged Robin, or Dusty Miller, or Lady Slipper, or 4 o'clocks, or what not. So, before Jack Frost could bite them hard, or the giants crush them, or a snowstorm bury them, or an avalanche roll over and flatten them out, or a cow eat them up, they hid themselves in all the crannies, cracks, and crevices of the rocks and down deep too. Wherever any sand or dust or moss or moisture was, there you would find a whole family of the young folks of the Poe family settled down, all growing up and able to take care of themselves. Now, like a great army, they are indeed. They laugh at winter's cold, or icy wind, or driving sleet, and even at that scorching south wind, the föhn, that blows for over 2 weeks in the springtime, and again for a fortnight in the autumn. By and by, in a little while, according to the fairy clock, that is 1,000,000 years or so, the kangaroo Poe had spread all over the Switzerland. 20,000 cows were made happy, for they loved to browse on the Poe pastures, and liked nothing better. Now, nearly 2 million of Swiss cows enjoyed the summer feast, while their bells tinkle on the hillsides. When the calves were too big for their mother's milk, and the lady cow got tired of being a restaurant for her calf, she pushed it away and said, in cow language, "Go and eat Poe." Sometimes the calf did not like to give up its baby habits, learned in the nursery. Then it behaved like the naughty boy who said, "I'm hungry, and bread I won't have. I want cake." Then the mother cow tried another plan. She would give notice to the cowherd in her own language that she had done her part and wanted him to attend to her naughty and bad-tempered or sulky calf. Then the man would put a leather strap with sharp nails on it over the calf's muzzle so that when calf wanted refreshment, it would be like sticking pins into its mother. Then the cow would push the calf away and make it learn to eat Poe. But once having taken a bite, the calf never again wanted to eat anything else. It tasted as good as candy to a little girl. So Switzerland became one of the greatest countries in the world for butter and cheese. The fairies rejoiced too, for the Po, with its pretty blossom, made the meadows, which were their dancing hall, more beautiful, and for them it was like waltzing on a cloth of gold. And to this day, the alpine Po is a wonderful among plants and grasses, as the opossum and kangaroo are among animals. The fairies that had succeeded in so clothing the edelweiss that lives among the rocks that it was able to resist the frost and cold were now very happy over their second venture. Like a brave and vigilant sentinel, the new flower kept guard. The Po was clothed so as to delight the cattle, while the edelweiss was dressed for beauty and to please mortals. Thus both man and beast were blessed. And it is even yet the flowers that, with vigilance and valor, guard Switzerland against the assaults of the ice giants and the frost army. These would make the land of the Edelweiss like the regions of the North Pole if it were not for the flowers and the grass. That is the reason why the Swiss people are not like the Northerners. Their beautiful country holds the chamois and the ibex and the birds instead of walruses and polar bears, and the people have bread and honey and cream instead of seal meat and blubber. And that is the end of the story. Hmm. That was certainly another one focusing on the magic of the fairies and the flowers. I feel like that is certainly a very common thing to tell stories about. I mean, by now we've certainly heard several. I, at this point, would assume that the Swiss really like the idea of fairies turning into flowers and conquering the land of the frost giants, winning inch by inch in their never ending war. Ah, my darlings. Mm. Oh, I'm almost finished with my tea at this point. Well, there it goes. I think I really should get myself a nice thermos, or at least a teapot of sorts, one that can hold quite a lot of nice tea for the evening. But in any case, let's carry on with another story because I sure am curious about what else is there to discover about these Swiss fairy tales. This is story number 18 with the title The Swiss Fairies in a Town Meeting. And it goes something like this. In Appenzell and some other cantons in the heroic Swiss Republic, many old democratic customs still prevail. One of these is seen in the Landsgemeinde, or meeting of all the men not only in a village, but in the whole canton or district. This long word means a mass meeting of voters. The people gather together in a great crowd when they wish to settle matters of public interest. They vote not by casting bits of paper in a box or with a voting machine, but by raising their hands. When the president of the meeting puts the question, tens of thousands of fingers at once go up in the air. This is the ancient form of the town meeting, which is still kept up. The Swiss fairies follow Swiss customs, and not long ago, one moonlit night, they met together on a glacier in a deep valley. They had much to talk about. It was not all gossip, but after much friendly chat that they began. Not one said, "How do you do?" for none of them ever get sick, or have influenza, or a cough, or the mumps, or measles, or toothache. They never have doctors, or take doses of medicine, or run or wrap flannel around their necks, or swallow castor oil, or have the doctor visit them and feel their pulses, or make them stick out their tongues. Instead of all this, the fairies usually inquire one of another in this fashion: how about those curious creatures called men? Or how are the mortals behaving? Such questions as, what are they up to now? Or what are they doing to spoil our fun? Are very common also. Some of them at this meeting wanted very much to tell about some of the tricks which they had played on foolish men, or how they had done a good thing or two to people they liked. There was, however, no time for a long chat, for it was said that much business was on hand. Moreover, the meeting must break up before daybreak. We shall not describe all that were present, for most of them looked like the fairies of other countries. Yet there were some entirely Swiss, and these are known or heard of only along the Rhine or the Rhone River, or on the mountains inside the country. The water fairies, quite the most numerous, were present in full force. There were the sprites, or necks, that live in and had come all the way from the river Neckar. They looked and behaved very much like the nixies of England. Undine was the general name of one family of the female water fairies. All of these were in the form of pretty young women. They loved to sit by the side of the brooks or water courses. Sometimes they lurk in the marshes among the reeds. They have very white hands and golden hair, which is full of waves or ripples that can beat Marcel or any other hair weaver. On their heads they wear a fillet or wreath made of pond lilies, and often have on a long white veil like mist. They are very sentimental and have tender emotions, and whisper often and sigh a great deal. They delight in dancing along the shore, and go flitting from one water lily to another, opening the gold hearts and lovely white petals of these flowers that grow in the water. These mist maidens were very attentive to all that was talked about, but they did not themselves say much. Like other pretty fairies, they were lovely to look at, but they had no soul, and if they had any brains, no one would ever know it. One would not expect to meet them at parties or at any daylight picnics, for they made it a rule never to be seen except on moonlit nights. It was therefore useless to look for them at any other time. Very much like Undine and her sisters were those in a delegation of fairies from the Grotto de Balm. This cave may be seen on the way to Chamois, but high up above the level of the road, and has stalactites hanging from the ceiling. The storyteller remembers it well, but when he was there, the fairies were all out, for it was broad daylight, when fairies do not allow themselves to become visible. How we two college boys wished we had spectacles that could pierce the light and make the fairies to be seen. These grotto folks that were at this mass meeting of the fairies looked much like human girls with olive complexions. But if one looked carefully, he would see that they had no heels. Their hair was the most wonderful part of them, for they never wore any clothes. When any human person came near, they could cover themselves up entirely with their tresses, so that nothing but their roguish, laughing faces were visible. They were great coquettes, and often appeared on mountain paths to lure away young hunters, but old men only laughed at them and hummed a tune and ditty about the spider and the fly, for they knew all the tricks of these grotto girls. Sometimes these pretty creatures carried lights at night and danced in circles, so it was very hard to tell one from another. Yet they looked very lovely, with their fresh faces, sparkling eyes, and pretty manners. Besides these charms, they had each one a soft, low voice. Of all these grotto girls, Finetta was the best known. In fact, some of these fairies belonged to the same families as fairies in other lands, though they spelled their names differently and talked German, French, or Italian, and what sounded like the speech which country people in Switzerland use. For instance, there were several of the Herwish folk, or first cousins to the will-o'-the-wisp. Several dozen of little creatures of this family, not much bigger than dolls, were on hand. They live on marshy ground and delight in lighting their little lanterns at night. Then they incite bumpkins and other dull fellows out of the regular path in the fields into the mud and swamp. When the clumsy chaps are floundering deep in the water and down among the frogs and tadpoles, the Herwish put out their lights and leave the louts in the wet, all the while laughing at them. Stupid fellows from the grog and beer shops, with their brains befuddled, are the victims of these merry mischiefs. It is good to see how many a drunkard gets a ducking and cooling off from these tiny tots. Some of the Herwish folk have wings like bats, and to the bold girl or boy that is too smart and makes fun of them, they come and flap their wings in their face, and this frightens them. Men especially, who have drunk too much wine, get easily scared. After it is dark, most people are careful not to anger or irritate the Herwishes in any way. Quite different in their bearing and looks, as well as in their ideas and manners, was another set of delegates to the fairy convention. These were gnomes, the kobolds, and the elves. They were near relations and looked very much alike, especially in stature and the color of their skin, and in all having beards. Most of them live underground and in the mines. These very industrious and lively little fellows are always busy. Many among them look like old men. When they talk to each other, Their long beards and chins wag up and down, so the boys and girls call them chin choppers. They wear funny peaked caps, each, each with a tassel on the end of it. They have to do with gold mines, where they understand all about fires, forges, coal, crucibles, and what one sees in a foundry. A long time ago, one of these gnomes amused himself and enriched the good people in a place called Plurs by pouring liquid gold in a crevice of the rocks. But having thus gained plenty of the precious metal, the people got to be very proud, like most mortals who get rich suddenly. They lost their good manners and got drunk and fell into very bad habits. When the gnomes saw that the heads of these mortals were turned, and that their hearts were like those of bad potatoes, they threw down tons of dirt upon the villages and destroyed them, just as men burn up caterpillars and potato bugs. It is true that at this meeting the elves, gnomes, and kobolds were, some of them, so black and sooty, and smelled so strongly of smoke and fire, that the more dainty fairies in gauzy dresses did not like to sit near them. Besides this, some of the kobolds came with their leather aprons on, and altogether they were such real blacksmiths that the doorkeepers did not want to admit them. At least the water fairies thought they might have taken off their aprons and washed up a little. Biggest of all at the assembly were the frost giants, and one of these, who towered above all, was chosen by a show of hands to be president of the meeting. A half acre was allowed him to sit down upon. When ready to tap for order, he picked up a boulder for a gavel which weighed a ton or more. With this he pounded on a flat rock. At the sound, all stopped talking, looked up, and listened. 1 minute before, it was like the buzzing of bees. Now all was silent. These frost giants, of whom a dozen or so were present, had ridden to the meeting each on his own avalanche, which he used for a bicycle. They all had long beards of icicles that appeared like stalactites in a cave. Their big eyes looked for all the world like locomotive headlights, and some of the little fairies were afraid to look at them. Their sabots, or wooden shoes, were hollowed out of whole trunks of fir trees, and when they walked they made an awful stamping noise. Their breath, like mist, rolled out in great clouds over the assembly, so that at times some of the fairies could not see the speaker, and several felt very chilly. Their voices in speaking sounded like rolling thunder. When the president pounded with his gavel, some of the fairies, sitting at the edge of the crowd, thought an earthquake had taken place. During the debate, when some of the frost giants lost their temper, it seemed at times as if they would hurl rocks at each other, or gobble up some of the smaller fairies, such as the elves or undines. In fact, the gentle flower fairies, that were very thinly clothed in gauzy dresses and loved warmth, shivered when a frost giant came near them, and some almost cried, lest they should get frozen. In fact, one brave little fairy borrowed a white fur coat made of Edelweiss velvet and boldly sat near the Frost King, to the mingled fear, anxiety, and admiration of her sisters. On the other hand, one cunning summer fairy, with a fan of flowers in her hand, enticed a young frost giant to come and sit down beside her. Then she threw a spell over him, and he was so wrapped up in her charm that she actually melted him with her beauty, so that when the meeting broke up, there was no frost giant there, but only a puddle of cold water, for that is what frost giants turn into when the weather is too warm. Each speaker mounted the platform, which was a big boulder with a flat top. When any of the frost giants who sat up in front made a speech, it was noticed that, while there were gnomes and kobolds out on the edge of the audience who shouted, "Louder, louder," some of the gentler fairies, who were nearer, put up their hands to their ears for fear of being deafened. It was hard to please all, and at one time, when there were too many on their feet and all wanted to talk at once, the president roared out that he would adjourn the meeting if there was not better order. As for the grotto girls, they were pointedly requested several times to stop whispering. It was a pretty long session, for all were allowed to have their say, just as at a town meeting of mortals. Yet when one of the big giants talked too long, or when a lovely and pretty fairy wandered in her thoughts and prattled too much without saying anything, the whole company coughed him or her down. After all, nothing much came of the meeting, for they could not agree. Here the president of the meeting pounded hard to call the long-winded fairy to order, lest he might keep on for a week. It would soon be sunrise, when they must all scamper. So, at the first streak of light in the east, down came the hammer of the president with a force that split the rock, and before half of those who wanted to speak had opened their mouths, the Congress was adjourned. And that is the end of the story. Oh, my sweethearts. That was quite an interesting one as well, wasn't it? A long story about the different kinds of fairies that live up in the Swiss mountains. There was quite a handful of them, wasn't there? So many frost giants and kobolds and elves, little fairy maids, creatures that lived in grottos. Oh no, not the kobolds. Indeed, LJ. Who knows what kind of mischief kobolds could get up to? Oh, Olga, I see you there. Welcome in. Happy to have you. Haven't seen what yet, but they definitely have seen me roll through the snow. Oh, Tech, that sounds just lovely. I myself am one to have a good roll about in the snow. How are you feeling after the story? Me? Well, it was very much a fairy centered story, right? And we got to see that they can never quite agree on anything, much like people in a lot of gatherings. I thought it was just quite whimsical. So, it was nice to read about their squabbles and the things that keep them busy as fairy folk. Mm. Oh, thank you very much for the hydrate, LJ. Right. Well, my sweethearts, let's do one last story for tonight, and that will mark five of them, which means we will have five for next time as well. So get cozy, snuggle up with your favorite blanket or a plushie, and let's go to story number 19. This one's called The Palace Under the Waves, and it goes something like this. Fashions change in the fairy world, as well as among mortals who live on the earth. The Swiss water fairies, called undines, at times grew tired of living down below the surface of the lakes and rivers. When restless, they longed to mingle in the village gatherings. They wanted to hear the lively music of the young men and maidens as they sang and danced. Their favorite time for waltzes was on moonlit nights, so it became quite common at these times for the fairy maids to swim up to the shore. Then these Udines changed themselves into girls and young men. They put on clothes that were deep green, the color of the waves. Slipping in among the dancers, they joined in the fun and merrymaking. In this manner, many a lad romped with a water fairy and even kissed her, thinking she was or might be his sweetheart. For in the dim light of the moon, it was not always easy to see clearly the face of one's partner. Many a lassie received an embrace or a salute on the lips from a lively dancer whom she supposed was a newcomer. He might not be well known in the village, she thought, though he appeared graceful and dressed very nicely in sea green, gauzy clothes. Yet no matter how hard these undines might try to get their clothes entirely dry, they could never wring out the water wholly of their garments, so that they were always more or less damp. If they had changed their form too quickly, their clothes would drip and make spots on the floor or ground. Often the village folk felt dampness on their limbs below the knees. Yet few ever gave the matter a second thought, for their minds were wholly set on having a good time, and they had it. Sometimes the lady fairies started rather late in the evening to take their swim to the lake shore, fearing to lose some of the fun and thinking they might even find the dancing all over and the people gone home to bed. They were in a great hurry, while on the strand to change into the form of mortals and put on their human clothes. So it happened that, when they joined in the dance. One sharp eyed fellow who was playing the violin for the measures noticed that something was wrong. In fact, he was so surprised that he suddenly stopped fiddling. Then, instantly, everybody dropped arms and stood looking around at the musician's stand to see what was the matter. In a moment, it was as quiet as a church aisle when the parson was praying. What he saw made his eyes big and round. Then, most impolitely, as some of the girls thought, he pointed to a maiden's green petticoat that was beneath her outer dress and that had come a little below her frock. It was dripping with water. Again, after looking with searching eyes at another and a third, he screamed out, "Folks and fellow villagers, don't you know you've got the Undines among you? Look there, and there, and there." Then he pointed with his fiddle bow to some of the prettiest of the female dancers. "Just feel the hem of their skirts, and you'll know what sort of guests have been dancing with you tonight." Whereupon every young man turned his female partner round, and some of them most ungallantly flapped their hands on their lower skirts. Feeling and finding that these were very damp, 4 or 5 of them at once lifted up their hands, which were incredibly wet, and shook off the drops. One bold fellow even went behind and seized the tail of his partner's petticoat. She seemed to be the sloppiest looking girl in the whole party, and actually wrung out a half-pint of water. Thereupon a tall, handsome fellow, leader of the Undine party of a half-dozen or so, put his 2 fingers in his mouth and gave a sort of whistle. At once all the Undines shouted and ran down to the water's edge. There they stopped a minute or two on the lake beach, and then leaped below the waves and disappeared. It sounded as if 6 big seals had made a dive. One villager, who pretended to be an Undine, ran quickly after these water sprites and saw them for a moment on the shore, when they changed their form before resuming their old shapes. He came back to tell a wonderful tale of what he had seen. When he examined the clothes they had left behind, they found that, though they looked shiny in the moonlight, the stuff was only that of some water plants, like seaweed. When arrived in their crystal palace under the waves, the king of the Undines gave the girl fairies a good scolding for not, in the first place, being more punctual in both starting and coming home, and next, for being in too much of a hurry in changing themselves into mortals. As for the others, he punished these by forbidding them ever to dance again on that side of the lake. Even after that, when on moonlit nights the village lads and lasses came out to waltz, they scrutinized each partner in the dance before allowing them to join in when the music began. Some among the younger set of girls felt offended at such a severe examination, but it was necessary, and the other girls agreed to it. Yet, even then, The water sprites would sometimes join in, for when everybody was lively and the fun was vast and furious, each one of the lads and lasses was too much excited to notice the dress, or to be certain as to who was who, or which was which, or what was what, or even to see the face of a partner. One night, the daughter of the lord of the great chateau, the Princess Baby, slipped out of the castle gate, along with several of her maids, and joined the village youth in their fun. At the very height of the dance, a young man became her partner in the waltz, chiefly because of his elegant clothes and polished manners. Though he did not talk, but expressed his offers and wishes by signs and motions, she enjoyed mightily his dancing, which was both deft and graceful. There was present, however, a sharp-eyed mother, a nurse, who had 3 nieces in the dance. She kept looking like a lynx at every lad in the party. At last, she noticed this unusually handsome and stylish fellow who seemed to wear finer clothes than most of the village boys. The old woman's suspicions were fully aroused when she saw the young couple linked arm in arm, and especially as he turned his body round in the dance. For when the moonbeams fell upon the skirt of his coat, it shone as only wet clothes could in the silvery light. The color reflected was that of wave green. Upon this, she made up her mind that this fine fellow was no other than the king of the crystal cavern, which was far down in the world under the waters. She was about to give the signal that would expose him when her mouth was shut and her limbs felt as if paralyzed by some unseen and unknown power, when she saw him offer to take as his partner the Princess Baby, the daughter of the castle lord. Smilingly, the lovely maiden put out her arms in return for his embrace. All she thought of was the fun and merit. Yet, within a few minutes after they had linked arms together, he started in a whirling dance. It was so rapid that the mother and the older spectators, who sat watching the young people, were too fascinated to speak or cry out. They noticed him whirling his partner around, but getting ever nearer the lakeside. Wider and wider were the circles they made, but all the time he was bringing her nearer the beach, while she seemed delirious with delight, apparently oblivious to everything but the rapturous motion. Reaching the shore, pausing hardly a moment, he leaped with her into the water, which was then silvered with the moonbeams and rippling with the breeze. Down, down below the sparkling waves, the king of the world under the water, for it was he, made her his wife and queen, but never would he let her go back home. There, among the great coral trees and groves of gold and silver, and amid heaps of shining gems, which a score of maidens to wait on her, valets and footmen, and servants of a strange sort, and with food rich and abundant, pleasing and tempting to both eye and palette, and with the most entrancing music ever at her command, she was enraptured. So delighted was she that the years passed away as days. Yet, even when touched with homesickness and longing for those she had left behind on earth, in her castle home she found herself watched and guarded. The gates, though made of emerald and sapphire, shut of themselves, because moved by some secret spring against her return. Having once eaten of fairy food and accepted her husband's gift, she could never again leave either the palace or the world under the waves. The crystal cavern was her prison. When she looked in the mirror, she found her teeth were wave green. She was now an undine. Yet in the village, where the story of the castle princess was told, it was declared that, on calm, still nights, when the moon shone brightest, the most delightful music could be heard coming up from the lake. Some of the fishermen were sure that, far below on quiet summer days, also when no wind blew and the sunbeams struck deep into the waters, they could peer down into the depths and see the walls and towers of this crystal palace. And that is the end of our last story tonight. Oh, my sweet darlings. That one, I think, was quite enjoyable. Hearing the tale of such water spirits who come up to dance on moonlit nights and are simply so enchanting. Yes, that one I liked very much. Even the ending, where the king of the water fairies came to dance himself and stole the young princess. Even that in itself was quite magical. Thank you so much for the stretch, Bard. I will gladly do so. Anna, hydrate. I do still have some water here with me. But I think for tonight we can end our story reading stream there. Oh my goodness. I know I certainly enjoyed reading all 5 stories to you, my darlings, because tonight I feel that the lot of them was very enchanting. After all, we got to learn so much of the fairies and their customs and their character. Oh, what a lovely time we had. And now, let's take a look at which sweet darling we may give a lovely rate to. Oh, well, I certainly do see one. I certainly see one of my very own and very treasured sweethearts, the one and only Aramir himself, my precious son-in-law. So, let's set out to raid Ura. And this time we can even go for a cozy mommy raid message. Oh, my own chat doesn't let me see my own emote? Oh well. That's fine. I hope it shows up for the rest of you. Well, in any case, I hope that all of my sweethearts out there are being nice and soft and comfortable, and that the rest of your day, wherever you are, is as beautiful and brilliant as you are. So, my darlings, at the end of our stream, as I like to say, my eternal light will be with you always.